They sent him an invitation to the 10-year reunion, not because they wanted to reconnect, but because they wanted to break him one last time. The man they once called the class loser, the one they mocked, ignored, and dismissed as a ghost. They laughed as they added his name to the digital guest list, already picturing him walking in alone, wearing a thrift store suit, looking as out of place as he did a decade ago. But when the night of the reunion arrived, and the ground beneath the estate began to tremble, the laughter stopped forever. What happened next would leave 200 of the city's elite speechless. Dear viewers, this is the story of a man who was treated like a ghost in his own youth, a man who was mocked, marginalized, and written off as a failure before he even had the chance to begin. It is a story of how a single act of petty cruelty, intended to finally break a man's spirit at a 10-year reunion, became the very spark that incinerated the social standing of the elite. It is the story of Bernard "Bernie Mac" MacArthur, and how his return from the clouds brought a billionaire's arrogance crashing down to the scorched earth. Hello family, welcome back. Before we begin, I have a small but heartfelt request. Please subscribe. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us share voices that would otherwise be forgotten. Voices of the quiet dreamers like Bernard, and stories that prove that true strength isn't found in a bank account, but in the character of those who serve. And in the comments, tell us which city in the world you are watching from today. Because together, we are not just telling stories. We are witnessing the triumph of the invisible. The rooftop bar hung above the city like a jewel suspended in amber light. Golden hour poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the rims of expensive whiskey glasses and painting long shadows across the table where 4 people sat in comfortable arrogance. Below them, the skyscrapers pierced the horizon like declarations of wealth, power that these 4 felt they owned by birthright. Henry occupied his chair with the casual ownership of a man who believed even the furniture existed to accommodate him. His navy blazer cost more than most people earned in a month, and his smile carried the hollow warmth of a professional who felt nothing. Real estate had made him a millionaire, but it hadn't made him kind. Beside him, Janet held her phone like a weapon of self-documentation. She captured 3 photos of the sunset in rapid succession, each calculated to look effortlessly beautiful for an audience that only existed in digital form. Her entire existence was curated for consumption. Across from them sat Paxton, a corporate attorney who wore skepticism like armor, and Lennox, the tech startup prodigy who checked his watch constantly because he believed his time was a currency more valuable than gold. They had been meeting for months to plan the Glen Ridge Academy reunion, an obsession that revealed their arrested development. People who had truly moved on didn't spend this much time recreating high school hierarchies. Henry stopped scrolling on his tablet, a predatory smile spreading across his face like oil on water. He turned the screen toward the others. "Wait," he said, his voice dripping with malicious inspiration. "What about Bernie Mac?" Janet glanced up, squinting at the screen before a sharp laugh burst from her throat. "Oh my God," she gasped. "Bernard MacArthur. I completely forgot he even existed." Paxton leaned forward, studying the yearbook photo of the boy who used to eat lunch alone in the art room every day. Are you serious? The scholarship kid who was obsessed with planes. Lennox grinned, his eyes lighting up with cruel brilliance. This is perfect. We send him an invitation. He shows up thinking he finally matters, that maybe things have changed. And we get to remind everyone exactly how far we've all come, Janet added, her laughter transforming into something sharper. The contrast alone would be a chef's kiss. Henry began typing, adding Bernard's name to the list with theatrical flair. Invitation delivered, he narrated. I bet he shows up in a rusted Honda Civic. They clinked their glasses together, the sound sharp and bright, sealing their pact of casual cruelty. They had no idea that while they were planning a joke, Bernard MacArthur was planning an arrival that would tear the very grass from their feet. Back when they were in college, the cafeteria was a theater of war where the lines of engagement were drawn in plastic trays and social standing. For Bernard MacArthur, the safest strategy was total retreat. While the rest of the student body at Glen Ridge Academy gravitated toward the central tables to perform the loud rituals of teenage status, Bernard sought the sanctuary of the second-floor art room. It was a place that smelled of turpentine and dried clay, a room where the light was better, but the silence was absolute. He sat in the far corner, hunched over a scarred wooden desk, his back pressed against a cabinet full of forgotten sculptures. He didn't have a phone to hide behind. Instead, he had a thick, used textbook titled Light Dynamics and Aeronautical Engineering. The pages were dog-eared, the margins filled with his own meticulous sketches of lift vectors and thrust ratios. While his peers were obsessed with who was dating whom, Bernard was occupied with the physics of escaping gravity. He turned the pages with a methodical focus, his concentration so absolute that he seemed to vibrate on a different frequency than the rest of the world. He had learned early on that in a place like this, invisibility was not a burden, it was armor. The door to the art room creaked open, admitting a gust of laughter that felt like a cold draft. Henry and Janet entered, followed by their usual retinue, looking for a place to film a video, or perhaps just a fresh target to alleviate their boredom. They stopped when they saw him, the invisible boy who lived in the margins. Janet held her phone up, the lens already seeking the contrast between her curated perfection and Bernard's solitary existence. "Look, it's the ghost," she whispered, though she made sure her voice carried. She panned the camera over his worn sweater and the oversized glasses that seemed to dominate his thin, intense face. Henry leaned over Bernard's shoulder, his shadow falling across the diagrams of jet engines. "What are you even reading, MacArthur? Is this for real?" He plucked a pencil from the table, twirling it with the casual ownership he felt over everything in the building. "You actually think you're going to fly one of these? You can barely make it through the hallway without tripping over your own feet." The group erupted in a ripple of cruel amusement. Janet leaned in, her eyes dancing with the calculated sharpness of someone who viewed other people only as props for her own narrative. "He's a dreamer, Henry. That's what they call people who have nowhere else to go." Bernard didn't look up. He didn't shout or give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He simply tightened his grip on the book, his eyes staring directly forward at a point on the horizon that only he could see. To him, they were just turbulence, unpredictable, loud, and ultimately temporary. He knew that the air up there, The air he planned to master was cold and thin, but it was honest. "Good luck with that, pilot," Henry mocked, dropping the pencil onto the textbook before they turned and swept out of the room, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Bernard waited until the sound died away completely. He picked up the pencil, smoothed the page where Henry's shadow had been, and returned to his calculations. He wasn't just studying engineering. He was plotting a trajectory that would take him so far above Glen Ridge Academy that their voices would eventually become nothing more than a faint, insignificant hum in the distance. The morning air inside Glen Ridge Academy always felt heavy with the scent of floor wax and expensive perfumes. But as Bernard rounded the corner toward the junior wing, a new, acrid smell cut through the atmosphere. A small crowd had already gathered in the hallway, their voices a low buzz of muffled snickers and expectant whispers. As Bernard approached, the circle parted with practiced cruelty, revealing his locker. The locker, once a neutral grey, had been transformed into a canvas of malice. Thick, dripping letters of neon orange spray paint screamed across the metal. The word ghost slanted and jagged, as if the person wielding the can had been shaking with laughter. Below it, smaller scrawls mocked his heritage and his dreams, the paint still wet and weeping down the vents like oily tears. Bernard stood before the ruin of his property, his backpack heavy on his shoulders. He could feel the heat of Janet's phone camera pointed at the side of his face, capturing the moment for a digital audience that thrived on the sight of broken things. He could hear Henry's rhythmic tapping against a nearby locker, a predatory beat waiting for the inevitable explosion. They were looking for the tremor in his hands, the glassiness in his eyes, or the slump of defeat that would signify their total victory. But Bernard gave them nothing. He didn't gasp. He didn't shout. He didn't even blink. He looked at the word ghost with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a failed experiment. To them, the word was an insult, a reminder that he didn't exist in their world. To Bernard, it was a confirmation of his strategy. If he was a ghost, it meant he was already haunting the halls they thought they owned. It meant he was something they couldn't truly touch, no matter how much paint they wasted. With a hand that remained as steady as a pilot on final approach, Bernard reached into his pocket and pulled out his key. The metal scraped against the lock, a sharp, defiant sound in the sudden silence of the hallway. The door creaked open, the wet paint sticking slightly at the hinges, but he didn't flinch as a few orange flecks marred his sleeve. Inside, his belongings had been tossed in a heap, his notebooks crinkled and his spare sweater dusted with locker's room grime. He reached in, retrieved his copy of Advanced Propulsion Systems, and tucked it under his arm. He didn't try to wipe the paint off. He didn't call for a janitor. He simply closed the locker door with a firm, decisive click. He turned to face the crowd, his gaze passing over Janet's lens and Henry's smirk with an unsettling lack of emotion. It was the look of a man who had already calculated the distance between where he stood and where he was going, and realized that none of the people in this hallway were on his flight path. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet, level, and entirely devoid of the salt of tears. The crowd, unsettled by the lack of a climax to their drama, stepped back. Bernard walked through the gap they provided, his pace measured and his head held high. Behind him, the laughter started up again, but it sounded thinner now, more forced, as if they were trying to convince themselves they had won. Bernard didn't look back. He was already thinking about the recruitment booth in the gymnasium, and the world that lay far beyond the reach of a spray paint can. The gymnasium was a humid cavern of echoed voices and desperate ambition. It was career day at Glen Ridge Academy, an afternoon where the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the frantic energy of students trying to secure their futures. Prestigious universities and high-end law firms occupied the center of the floor, their glossy banners promising corner offices and six-figure starting salaries. In the far corner, near the bleachers where the light was a bit dimmer, sat a small, unassuming table draped in a dark navy cloth. There were no flashing screens or high-tech demonstrations here, just a few stacks of brochures, and a man in a crisp, olive-drab uniform whose posture suggested he had spent his life standing against winds much stronger than anything Glen Ridge could produce. Bernard moved toward the booth with a deliberate step, his eyes fixed on the scale model of an advanced tactical jet sitting on the table. To him, that model wasn't a toy, it was a promise. He felt the familiar weight of the crowd's judgment as he stepped away from the line for the Ivy League recruiters. He could sense them before he heard them, the predatory cluster of Henry, Janet, and their friends drifting toward the back of the gym like a storm front. "Oh, look!" Janet's voice rang out, clear and sharp as a glass shard. "Bernie's finally found his people. I guess the ghost wants to disappear for real this time." She raised her phone, the lens capturing the contrast between the drab recruitment table and the expensive, tailored blazers of the students nearby. Henry didn't miss his cue. He stepped forward, snapping his heels together with a loud, theatrical thud. He brought his hand up to his brow in a stiff, exaggerated salute that was a caricature of respect, his face contorted into a mocking mask of solemnity. "General MacArthur, reporting for duty." Henry barked, drawing a wave of unrestrained laughter from the onlookers. "Will you be flying a paper plane into combat? Or are you just joining so you can wear a uniform that actually fits?" The recruitment officer didn't flinch, his eyes meeting Bernard's with a look of shared, unspoken understanding. Bernard didn't look back at Henry. He didn't acknowledge the cameras or the performative cruelty. He simply reached out and took a pamphlet from the table. His hand was steady, his fingers brushing the high-gloss image of a cockpit in flight. "Thank you, Sergeant," Bernard said, his voice a low, resonant anchor in the sea of shrill laughter. He tucked the pamphlet into his bag with the same careful reverence he gave his engineering books. In that moment, the gymnasium and its petty hierarchies seemed to shrink. While the others were busy performing for an audience of teenagers, Bernard was looking at a map of the world they didn't even know existed. He walked away with his head high, leaving the echoes of their mocking salutes behind him, already imagining the sound of a turbine engine drowning out the noise of his past. The Cascadia Grand Estate sat atop a manicured ridge like a fortress of modern privilege, its limestone walls glowing under the strategic placement of soft, architectural lighting. Inside the grand ballroom, the air was a pressurized blend of expensive floral arrangements, heavy colognes, and the sharp, metallic tang of top-shelf champagne. It was a sea of designer silk and custom-tailored wool, a gathering of the region's nouveau riche who navigated the room with the practiced grace of people who believed the world was a stage built specifically for their performance. Henry moved through the crowd with the ease of a shark in familiar waters, his hand resting lightly on Janet's waist. She was a vision in a gown of shimmering obsidian that seemed to absorb the light of the crystal chandeliers, her eyes constantly scanning the room, not for friends, but for mirrors. They were the center of a gravity well, surrounded by former classmates who still looked to them to define the evening's social temperature. But despite the laughter and the clinking of crystal, the core of their attention remained tethered to the long, winding driveway visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Any sign of the guest of honor?" Janet whispered, her voice barely audible over the smooth jazz quartet playing in the corner. She adjusted her grip on her phone, the screen already open to her camera app, ready to broadcast the arrival to her thousands of followers. Henry checked his watch, a rose gold piece that caught the light with every movement, and smirked. Not yet, but give it time. A 10-year-old Honda Civic usually has trouble with the incline on the north gate. I'm surprised he hasn't overheated halfway up the drive. Paxton and Lennox joined them, their laughter joining the symphony of arrogance. They had spent the last hour speculating on Bernard's appearance, painting a vivid, cruel picture of a man who had spent a decade failing while they were busy winning. They imagined the polyester suit, the nervous sweat of someone who knew they didn't belong, and the desperate, hopeful expression of a loser looking for a seat at a table that would never be offered. "I heard he's still living in a studio apartment," Lennox remarked, swirling a glass of amber liquid that cost more than a month's rent for most. "Probably spends his weekends at the library, still reading those flight manuals he used to carry around like a security blanket." "It's almost a mercy, really," Janet said, her eyes glinting with a predatory light. "Coming here will be the highlight of his decade. We're giving him a story to tell his co-workers at the post office, or wherever it is people like that end up." They moved toward the balcony, positioning themselves like sentinels of the elite. Every time a pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the property, the group tensed with anticipation, waiting for the reveal of a rusted fender or a sputtering engine. Several luxury SUVs and German sedans rolled past, depositing guests who were greeted with lukewarm nods. The joke was the only thing keeping the night interesting for them. The driveway remained clear for a few minutes, the silence of the estate's grounds contrasting with the rising volume of the party behind them. The clique stood in the cool night air, their comfortable arrogance shielding them from the reality of the world beyond their ridge. They were so busy looking down the road, so focused on the horizon where they expected failure to appear in a cloud of exhaust, that they failed to notice the subtle change in the atmosphere. The wine in their glasses began to vibrate, tiny concentric circles forming on the surface of the liquid, and the distant, rhythmic thrumming of the air began to drown out the jazz. They kept their eyes on the ground, never thinking to look at the sky. The jazz quartet tapered off into a practiced silence, replaced by the amplified chime of a microphone being tapped. Henry stood on the raised dais at the front of the ballroom, the light from the massive LED screen behind him casting a halo around his perfectly coiffed hair. He held a crystal flute of champagne in one hand, looking every bit the conquering hero of a world built on quarterly earnings and social leverage. If I could have everyone's attention, Henry projected, his voice smooth and commanding. Before we get to the main event, we wanted to take a little stroll down memory lane, to remember where we started, so we can appreciate just how far we've all climbed. A ripple of expectant murmurs moved through the room. Janet moved to the front row, her phone held high like a torch to capture the crowd's reaction. With a theatrical click of a remote, the screen flickered to life. At first, it was the usual montage of varsity captains and prom royalty, vibrant, polished faces frozen in moments of peak popularity. But then, the music shifted to a mocking, whimsical tune, and the screen transitioned to a single, high-resolution image. It was Bernard's sophomore yearbook photo. The lighting was harsh, capturing every detail of his thin, angular face and the oversized, thick-rimmed glasses that slid perpetually down his nose. He looked startled, his eyes wide and uncertain, caught in a moment of profound vulnerability. He was wearing a sweater that was clearly 2 sizes too large, his narrow shoulders swallowed by the fabric. It was the portrait of a boy who was trying his best to be invisible and failing. The ballroom erupted. It started with a snort from Paxton in the front, which quickly ignited into a roar of unrestrained laughter that bounced off the vaulted ceilings. 200 people, dressed in thousands of dollars of silk and lace, leaned into each other, pointing at the screen with cruel delight. "Look at those glasses," someone shouted over the din. "He looks like he's about to calculate the trajectory of his own lunch money being stolen." Janet was laughing so hard she had to lean against a marble pillar, her camera shaking as she panned from the screen to the laughing faces of their peers. "This is it," she whispered into her microphone, narrating for her digital followers. "The ghost of Glen Ridge in all his glory. 10 years later, and some things never change." Henry stood on the stage, basking in the chaos he had orchestrated. He didn't need to say another word. The image was doing all the work. It was a ritual of communal shaming, a way for everyone in the room to feel taller by standing on the neck of a memory. They laughed at the boy who had no voice, the boy who had spent his graduation standing alone, the boy they were certain was at that very moment parking a dented sedan in the shadows of the estate. The laughter reached a fever pitch, a deafening wall of sound that seemed to vibrate the very air. But then, a different kind of vibration began to assert itself. It wasn't the sound of voices. It was a low-frequency hum that started in the soles of their feet and traveled up through their spines. The massive crystal chandeliers above began to chime against one another, a frantic, glass-on-glass warning. Henry frowned, looking up at the ceiling as the unrestrained laughter began to falter, dying off row by row. The rhythmic thumping was becoming a roar, a mechanical heartbeat, so powerful it began to rattle the champagne flutes on the tables. The image of the awkward boy on the screen suddenly felt like a relic from a different universe. Something was coming from the sky, something heavy and violent, and it was moving toward the center of their carefully curated world with the force of a hurricane. The mechanical roar became a physical weight, a wall of sound that shattered the remaining fragments of the party's composure. Inside the ballroom, the crystal chandeliers didn't just sway. They danced violently, their glass prisms chiming a frantic, dissonant warning as the vibrations traveled through the steel and stone of the Cascadia Grand Estate. The mocking slideshow was forgotten, the image of the awkward teenage boy now a flickering, irrelevant ghost against the sheer power of the present moment. Henry stumbled back from the podium, his champagne flute slipping from his fingers and shattering on the hardwood. He didn't notice. His eyes, like those of every other guest in the room, were drawn to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the night sky had been swallowed by a predatory shadow. A gargantuan, matte-black shape descended from the clouds, its twin rotors beating the air into a frenzy. The unrestrained laughter of minutes ago was replaced by a hollow, terrified silence. Janet stood paralyzed, her phone still raised, but her thumb had frozen over the record button. The screen showed only a blur of movement as the downwash from the arriving craft hit the estate with the force of a localized hurricane. On the manicured lawn below, the meticulously curated landscape was being systematically dismantled. The wind-whipped grass flattened into a desperate radial pattern, and the ornamental shrubs were shredded in seconds. The military craft, a high-performance transport jet with vertical takeoff capabilities, didn't just land, it occupied the space. As it touched down, the heavy struts hissed, and the massive weight of the machine carved deep, violent grooves into the earth, kicking up clods of dirt and expensive mulch that pelted the glass windows like shrapnel. The sheer audacity of the arrival felt like an assault on the very concept of the estate's gated privacy. 200 of the city's elite stood pinned against the interior walls, their designer dresses and custom suits suddenly looking like flimsy costumes in the face of such raw, industrial might. The jet sat on the ruined lawn, its engines whining down into a low, menacing growl that seemed to vibrate in their very marrow. The landing lights cut through the darkness, strobing into the ballroom and blinding the spectators. For a long minute, nothing moved. The dust and debris swirled in the dying wind, settling over the shattered remains of the clique's expectations. They had been waiting for a rusted Honda to sputter up the driveway. Instead, the sky itself had opened up to drop a Titan onto their doorstep. Then, the side hatch hissed open. A ramp descended with a heavy, hydraulic thud, striking the torn earth like a gavel. The interior of the craft was bathed in a clinical, red tactical light. A figure emerged from the shadows, not the stumbling, hesitant boy from the slideshow, but a silhouette of absolute authority. The ghost had finally arrived, and he hadn't come to join the party, he had come to end it. The silhouette standing at the top of the ramp was a sharp, geometric contrast to the billowing smoke and the chaotic light of the ballroom. As the figure descended, the rhythmic clink of flight gear against the metal ramp provided the only soundtrack to the collective breath held by 200 people. The man who stepped onto the ruined grass of the Cascadia Grand Estate moved with a terrifying economy of motion, a stride that spoke of decks pitched by heavy seas and horizons conquered at mock speeds. He stopped 10 feet from the glass doors, his face still obscured by the dark, polarized visor of a flight helmet. The flight suit was charcoal gray, covered in tactical patches and the subdued glint of rank insignia that most in the room were too uneducated in valor to recognize. Janet's phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the marble floor, but she didn't look down. No one did. With a slow, deliberate movement, the pilot raised his hands, and unlatched the helmet. As he pulled it away, the harsh spotlights of the jet caught the sharp lines of a face that had been forged in the crucible of discipline. Bernard "Bernie" Mac MacArthur stood before them, his hair cropped short, his gaze steady and piercing. Gone were the oversized glasses and the hesitant slouch of a boy who wanted to disappear. In their place was a man who had seen the world from 30,000 feet and found the people standing in this room to be incredibly small. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a vacuum created by the sudden collapse of their reality. Henry stood at the edge of the terrace, his expensive blazer suddenly looking like a cheap costume. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. The class loser they had spent the evening lampooning was now the only person in the vicinity who possessed true gravity. Bernard didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped through the shattered glass of the terrace door, his boots crunching on the remnants of the champagne flutes. He walked directly toward the dais, the crowd parting for him like a retreating tide. He didn't look at the screen where his awkward teenage self was still frozen in digital amber. He looked directly at Henry. "You haven't changed the password to your secondary server in 3 years, Henry," Bernard said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a resonance that made the chandeliers vibrate once more. It was the voice of a man used to being heard over the roar of a turbine. Henry blinked, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. "Bernie, you were just making sure I knew my place," Bernard finished for him. He reached into a tactical pocket on his thigh and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. A printed transcript of the email thread Henry had started 6 months ago. He tossed it onto the podium. It fanned out, revealing the subject line, "The Ghost Hunt, bringing MacArthur home for one last laugh." "I didn't come here because I thought you wanted to see me," Bernard said, his eyes locking onto Henry's with a cold, clinical detachment. "I came here because I wanted to see if 10 years of success had given you anything resembling a soul. But looking at this room, I realize you're all still trapped in that hallway at Glen Ridge, holding spray paint cans and hiding behind screens." He turned his gaze to Janet, who was trembling. "The contrast you wanted, Janet. You got it. But it's not between my suit and yours. It's between the man who serves a country and the people who only serve themselves." Bernard reached into his pocket and produced a small, velvet-lined box, clicking it open to reveal the silver star. He didn't say what it was for. He didn't have to. The medal caught the light, a silent testament to a bravery that no one in the room could ever hope to buy. He looked at the 200 guests, his expression one of profound pity. "You spent 10 years trying to make sure I remained a ghost. But it's not me who's invisible tonight. It's all of you." The heavy silence that followed Bernard's words was more deafening than the jet's engines. He didn't wait for an apology, and he certainly didn't wait for their forgiveness. He had outgrown the need for either years ago. With a final, lingering look at the pale, ghost-like faces of Henry and Janet, Bernard turned his back on the glittering facade of the ballroom. He walked back through the shattered glass doors, his boots crunching with a finality that signaled the end of an era. Waiting at the base of the ramp was a silver-haired man in a formal dress uniform, his chest a tapestry of service ribbons. General Vance, a man who had commanded divisions and navigated international crises, stood at rigid attention. As Bernard approached, the general's hand snapped to his brow in a crisp, sharp salute, a gesture of genuine, unyielding respect for a subordinate who had surpassed every expectation. Bernard returned the salute, the two men sharing a moment of silent, martial understanding that made the social posturing inside the estate look like child's play. Bernard climbed the ramp, the hydraulic hiss of the door closing acting as a curtain call. Inside the cockpit, the amber glow of the instrument panels reflected in his eyes, the only light that mattered now. The twin turbines began their rising scream, a mechanical crescendo that vibrated through the limestone foundations of the Cascadia Grand Estate. The guests huddled by the windows, their faces pressed against the glass as the massive craft began to lift. The downwash of the rotors performed a final act of purification, scattering the remaining party decorations and sending the clique's expensive wine glasses tumbling from the outdoor tables. The jet rose smoothly into the night sky, its navigation lights blinking like a receding heartbeat until it was nothing more than a distant star swallowed by the horizon. Inside, the party was dead. Henry stood staring at the podium, the printed emails mocking him with his own words. Janet looked at her phone, realizing that for the first time in her life, she had captured something she didn't want the world to see. One by one, the guests began to leave, their conversations hushed and their movements hurried. They left behind the half-eaten catering and the hollow echoes of their own laughter. An hour later, the estate was silent, the lights dimmed and the gates locked. But the transformation was permanent. On the center of the pristine, manicured lawn, the grass was gone, replaced by deep, jagged trenches where the jet's landing gear had bitten into the soil. The earth was scorched and torn, carved with permanent grooves that no amount of landscaping could truly erase. It was a physical scar on the face of their privilege, a lasting reminder that the class loser had returned as a giant, and in his wake he had left them all in the dirt. So, what do you think? Did Henry and Janet finally get the reality check they deserved? Or is some ground too scorched to ever truly heal? Could you find the strength to return to the very place that tried to break you, not with anger, but with the quiet, deafening proof of your own success? What defines a person's worth? The designer labels they wear in a ballroom, or the scars and stars they earn in the cockpit of a machine that touches the edge of space? Drop a comment and let me know. And tell me, have you ever been a Bernard? The one they wrote off as a ghost? The one who spent lunch hours alone dreaming of a horizon no one else could see? Or have you been the one standing on that lawn, realizing too late that the person you mocked was the only one in the room with the courage to truly fly? We all need to remember that the view from the top looks a lot different when you've actually earned the wings to get there. If you were moved by this story of a class loser who returned as a commander, about a man who traded the silence of an art room for the roar of a turbine, and about a group of elites who learned that status is a fragile thing when faced with real valor, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. I post new high-stakes stories of unexpected triumph and poetic justice every day, and you won't want to miss the next arrival. Like this video if you crave more stories about quiet strength, about the underdogs who rewrite the sky, and about the moments where arrogance finally meets its match. Your likes tell me you want more tales of unbreakable humanity. The kind that doesn't just survive the bullying, but rises so far above it that the past becomes a speck in the rearview mirror. This is Mr. Elegant Stories, where true power isn't found in a digital guest list, but in the discipline of the climb, where a ghost can become a legend, and where the best revenge is simply becoming someone they can no longer ignore. Until tomorrow, remember, they can spray paint your locker and they can mock your dreams, but they can't touch the sky. Sometimes the best way to answer your critics is to leave them standing in the dust of your departure.